Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and our guest is attorney Mario Salas. We're going to talk about what parents should know about special education. But before we get into the topic, let's have Mr. Counselor tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. My history in special education goes back way before law school. I worked at the Virginia Institute of Autism, which is a small private nonprofit school here in Charlottesville that primarily serves children with autism. I started there right after I graduated from UVA as an undergrad. And I was an instructor there at first, so I worked kind of one-on-one with students, then rose through the ranks and eventually became a lead teacher in charge of my own classroom of between 4 and 6 students aged 16, 17, to all the way through age 21. And in that role, I was a licensed applied assistant behavior analyst. So I was skilled with administering applied behavior analytic therapy, which is a tried and true method of intervention with kids with autism. And then that role really springboarded me into law school. I became really passionate about special education and helping parents understand their rights, helping the school to mediate with the parents to try to find a middle ground that worked for the student. And now I'm at the Legal Aid Justice Center, which is a legal aid law firm, nonprofit law firm here in Charlottesville that serves low-income residents of Charlottesville and the surrounding counties. We handle a set of civil issues, but my specialty is in the area of special education, again, and other educational disputes.
Okay, that's great. So let's get started with our title, what parents should know about special education. First thing we should talk about is, what is special education?
Yeah, well, special education really looks differently depending on the kid, and that's I think the hallmark of it. So special education is a product of federal law. It's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that law came into being in the 90s, but is sort of piggybacking off of previous legislation, federal legislation, that really is geared towards keeping kids with disabilities in school alongside their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent practical. Special education really is the sort of core of it is it's a document called the Individualized Education Program, or IEP. And so many parents who are watching may have heard of that term before, IEP. There's a lot of acronyms in the world of special education, so I'll do my best to try to spell those out as we go. But really the sort of core purpose of the IEP is to convene regularly a group of teachers, administrators, parents, and the child, where appropriate, and wherever possible, really, to discuss ways for the student to be included alongside their general education peers as much as possible.
Okay, so we talked about special education, inclusiveness into regular education.
Yeah.
But what is the regular education, the term?
So when I refer to regular education, that's your standard classroom environment. The regular classroom where a teacher is delivering the same lesson to all the students and is not really, sort of incorporating individualized modifications for the specific student. What special education does is reverse that, so that the teacher is then individually addressing the student's unique needs, whether they be, from some kind of emotional need, whether they be from, a physical disability. Really, the range is quite varied in special education. And so, the core distinction, I think, between regular education is that you can think of it as sort of general, one-size-fits-all. What we, think of traditionally as education. Special education is, again, that sort of focused, very planned, deliberate, and sort of regularly revisited analysis of whether the student is making progress.
The student is the focus.
The student is the focus at the middle of the IEP. Absolutely.
Well, as a parent, and many parents have asked me, is Mel, how do I know my child needs special education?
Yeah, this is a question I get all the time from clients, and I often meet with community members, parents just in the community to host workshops, and this is a question I get all the time. What do I do if I'm concerned? And really, I think it boils down to, if you're concerned that your child might need special education, might need that extra sort of individualized focus, then you talk about it. One theme that I really hope to bring out from today is that communication, relationship building, and early sort of addressing concerns is key to ensuring that a child with a disability is successful in school. The federal law, the IDEA, what I talked about at the beginning, says that really anybody can initiate the special education eligibility process. So one thing I haven't talked about so far is how does a kid get into special education in the first place? And it really starts with this referral. That can come from a teacher, it can come from a parent, it can come from a grandparent, it can come from a cousin, it can come from your neighbor, so long as the person has knowledge of the kid's disability, or of the child generally, really. It's always best to do that in writing, and that would be addressed to the school administrator. And it simply has to say, I think that my child is in need of special education, and it's always best to be detailed and maybe include some reasons why. For example, my child is getting repeatedly suspended, or I'm getting calls home every day. My child is in 3rd grade and they are not able to read a book that a kindergartner might be able to start to read. Those types of things are helpful to include because it orients the next step of the process to look at those sort of concerns, okay? The process is multi-stepped, multi-tiered, I guess. The referral, that letter to the administrator kicks off the process, and then there's a fork in the road where 3 forks in the road. The school can do nothing, most of the time that doesn't happen. The school can initiate the eligibility determination process, which I'll get into in a second, or it can take a sort of intermediate position and say, well, we're going to look at this a little bit more carefully, and then at the end of that period, we'll decide whether the evaluation is necessary. The evaluation sort of step, again, if the school decides let's sort of move ahead with eligibility determination, the evaluations entail a set of really tests, assessments, anecdotal reports from parents about what the child does at home. So the sort of core areas are the educational performance. How is the child performing on standardized assessments of math, reading, writing, achievement, stuff like that. Psychological assessments, so what's the student's IQ? Does the student have any psychological sort of diagnoses, maybe depression or anxiety or any number of things. And there's several other evaluation types. And all of these evaluations happen over a fixed period of time. And that's one of the other hallmarks of special education, is that a lot of the students' rights to be included in the regular education are sort of protected by things like timelines and required meetings and required forms of documents, sort of what goes into it rather than what comes out, if that makes sense. More procedure over what the outcome is. And so kind of along those lines, there's a fixed timeline in which these evaluations happen. At the end of that, the team, parents, teachers, administrators, the people who did the evaluations, get together and they decide, does the student need special education? That in itself is a detailed question. Just because a child has a diagnosis that they have a disability, just because a child has a diagnosis of, again, anxiety or depression, autism even, doesn't mean that they go in to special education right away.
Okay. So my question is then, what if the parent disagrees with the assessment? What happens?
Sure, and that happens a lot. There are any number of reasons why a parent might not want their child to be in special education. Part of my job as an attorney is counselor too. And so I try to educate my clients, parents, as much as I can about what special education really is, to try to break down some of those, because the information is very technical, it's complex. People have a lot of, in my experience, attitudes that are formed about it from their own experience in high school. And any parent who has a child with a disability or other needs is on some level grieving. And it's a very difficult question to answer for parents. Do I need my child to be in this sort of other route? You know, parents want, I think, the best for their kids, of course. And so the first thing I do is try to say it's not a bad thing. It can be a great thing, and it's not a forever thing either. It doesn't mean that the child can't go to college. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that they get more attention, and isn't that a good thing? But even then, you know, there's some parents who don't want their child to be in special education for any number of reasons again. And the parent in the whole process throughout special education has a tremendous amount of power. Really, sort of the buck stops with the parent. In Virginia, that's especially true. Even though I said earlier that special education is a product of federal law, states can do more than what the federal law. So imagine the federal law is the floor. States can come in and do extra and require more of their own schools. And in Virginia, we have some interesting ways that our laws add to the federal law. One of those ways is by configuring the power that the parents hold in a way that allows them to kind of stop the process from moving forward. So if a parent disagrees, all they have to say is, I disagree, and nothing changes. The interesting part of eligibility is that schools under federal law have an obligation to locate and provide services for children who need special education. That's called the child find obligation. You'll hear that tossed around a lot. And that really amounts to a pressure for the schools to go out and look for kids that need special education. The whole idea behind special education law is that, you know, the country before special ed consisted of schools that were segregated. Some kids with disabilities didn't even get services at all in school. Schools were just not required to do anything really for them. And so over, decades, that has morphed into what we have now, all of these sort of protections. And so in a way, special education law is a civil rights law at its core. It's about anti-segregation, anti-discrimination, inclusion, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the parent holding power in this context too. But at the same time, schools have this independent obligation to find kids. So where does that conflict get resolved? Schools will have to revisit the question as to whether the kid needs special education down the road, because that obligation to find kids and help them exists still. But parents, will still have to say no. And I mean, ultimately, my advice for many parents is to be open-minded.
Okay, mediation's a good thing at this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question I have to ask you now.
Sure.
We have young kids who have gone to certain schools for quite a bit of time, and now all of a sudden they're designated or assessed to be special needs kids. Do they stay in that school, or do they have to be traveled or transported to another school?
Yeah, that is another question I get a lot from parents, sort of the idea that if my child is in special education, they're going to be in a different classroom, they're not going to be around their friends, they're on a different track. And that can be true for some students, but the law requires kids to be educated alongside their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent practical. And so long as the student with the disability can be educated satisfactorily in the regular education environment, that's where the law says they have to go. The law calls it the least restrictive environment requirement. You'll hear that called LRE, least restrictive environment. And the whole idea is that, kids can, if a kid needs to be educated in a different setting, then you don't go all the way to the most restrictive other place. You sort of go down. There's a continuum. The idea is that on one end of the continuum you have your regular education classroom, and some kids in special education spend all their time in the regular education classroom. And if that's not possible, if for some reason you're not able to implement the IEP, which I talked about at the beginning, sort of that roadmap for what the student is going to learn over the year, then you move down the continuum to more restrictive placements. And that doesn't mean you jump right to going to a separate school like the place that I taught for many years. It just means that you're always looking for the place, the IEP team, the people who are making the decision, again, that child focus, the team that meets around the kid, is always looking for ways to make sure that kid is included as much as possible. It goes back to that anti-segregation principle. Mm-hmm. And so, you'll have kids who have a mix, regular education, Maybe they spend one period in a special education classroom. Maybe a kid needs more than that for their IEP to be implemented satisfactorily, and so they might spend half a day, or a full day. Or maybe their needs are so great that they have to be in a different setting where the structure is very modified. It's a smaller teacher-student ratio. Like the school where I worked, it was largely one-on-one all day long. That's simply not practical in a regular education environment. And so, to the extent that the kid needs it, the law says that's okay. But if the kid doesn't need to be in a more restrictive place, the law is always diverting kids to the sort of more traditional setting.
Okay, and be inclusive.
Yeah.
Okay, but one thing parents ask me is my daughter or my son has been in special education throughout high school. When does special education ends?
So there are a few ways it ends. One is that the sort of simplest way is that the kid gets a diploma and graduates. Just because you're in special education doesn't mean you're sort of prevented from getting a diploma.
That's a good thing.
That's a great thing, yeah, and something that the law really pushes schools to do for every kid. Of course, that's not going to be possible for some students who simply aren't able to meet the normal diploma requirements. So one example is in Virginia, we've all heard about the SOLs. Parents know them, kids know them very intimately because that's what the curriculum is focused on right now. But to graduate with a diploma, you have to pass a certain number of SOLs while you're in high school of a certain type. And some kids simply aren't going to be able to do that. And for those kids, a diploma is not available, so then how does special education end? So again, one category, you get a diploma, you graduate, you're done. Another one is just by aging out of special education. And the federal law, and Virginia laws too, says that eligibility for special education is bound by age. And so generally it goes from age 3 through age 21. And so that includes to your 22nd birthday. And a lot of people are surprised by that because they think 18, you're done with high school. But for kids in special education, and again, who have been through the eligibility process, which is not an easy one to go through, again, disability does not equal special education. But for kids who do make it through the eligibility process, their sort of high school years get opened up. And they're able to stay in high school if they don't have a diploma through age 22. And that can be a really good thing, for kids whose needs are more significant because it allows them more time to be prepared to enter adulthood, where services and other supports are virtually non-existent in Virginia and across the country. Which I'll get into that in just a second. But the sort of third way eligibility ends for special education is if the team decides, hey, the kid doesn't need special education anymore. They're making progress without the intervention of special education.
This is continuous assessment of the child.
Yep, and so again, the law requires schools to meet annually at least. So let me be more precise about that. The IEP team to meet annually. So this is the team of parents, administrators, teachers. They're required to meet at least annually to discuss progress and to modify the IEP. And then one other requirement is that schools have to sort of revisit the question of eligibility once at least every 3 years. And so sometimes you'll go through that redetermination process and you'll come out on the other end, this eligibility is not appropriate anymore. The reason, again, goes back to that whole disability does not equal special education issue. It's actually a three-pronged question. Okay. Is there a disability? Does the kid need special education to make progress? And does the disability have an adverse impact on the student's performance? Okay, so any one of those questions answered no, and you're not eligible.
Okay. Yep. We're at halftime now, and so I have to give my little spiel.
Sure.
This is the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and our guest is attorney Mario Salas, and we're talking about what parents need to know about special education. And he just took us through the first part of special education, and you got to the 3 prongs. Do you want to elaborate on those? Or?
Sure. I mean, I could spend a lot of time on why those questions, each one might kind of derail eligibility. But what I really want to do is go back to the issue that you pointed out just now, which is what happens when a kid who might turn 22 at the end, and what do they do the next day? Literally from one day to the next. And you'll hear the analogy all the time. It's like falling off a cliff, because it really is. When I was in law school, this was a big focus of mine. When I was a teacher, this was a huge focus of mine, is transition. Post-secondary transition, that transition from school, this very supportive, warm place almost, to adulthood when there are no analogous services. I mean, there is no right to an education past 22. There's no right to other types of services like that. It's just like the bottom falls out. And so you have a collection of other things that kind of together might form some kind of safety net. And I'm talking about, Medicaid for health insurance, Social Security for income, the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services, which is a Virginia state agency that administers vocational rehabilitation programs in the state. So work training, job training, but a host of other things too. That is there to a very limited extent right now because funding has dried up for that agency so much that they are only able to provide services to the most sort of significantly needy groups. And so that really is it. And then there's community organizations like Parks and Recreation. There's entities like WorkSource or other sort of job-oriented community organizations that might be able to provide some kind of services, but those are going to cost money. Not everybody has that. And so the distinction goes from public school, which is free, you get all these rights, federal law requires the school to do things, to you got to pay. And it's up to the parent in many cases for a kid with significant needs, and even not, to create a enriching life, and
whether they can afford it. That's the other thing.
That's an absolutely huge issue. I mean, when I was a teacher, I worked with families who couldn't do that, and many times they were facing the question of what do I do with my now adult child who is going to be 30 years old soon. And my time is sort of ticking too, but really that just the lack of a safety net is very distressing and disturbing how it can shift so quickly, and how parents I think are really shocked when they get to this point, when they get to age 17, 18, 19, and it becomes clear, my kid might have to live with me forever. What do I do about that?
That's an important point.
It's huge, and parents have some resources. For example, kids who have significant needs might be eligible for certain Medicaid services that are geared towards keeping the adult at home and not in some kind of restrictive setting like a hospital or other residential setting. And there may be some community sort of activities and other types of case management services that the adult now can engage in that are through Medicaid, but not everyone's going to be eligible for that, and there's going to be a huge number of adults in this gap where there's just not really a whole lot for them to do.
Okay, one thing we didn't talk about is different categories.
Oh, sure.
Of special education.
Yeah,
I think parents need to know about these categories of whether or not their child may fit into them or not.
So this again goes back to that sort of space between disability and special education. Just because you have a diagnosis of autism, that's probably a bad example, a diagnosis of depression doesn't mean you get into special education right away. There are a number of rigidly defined categories under the law, under federal and state law. And one question for the team to decide at the initial eligibility process, way back when you first got your referral for special education, one question is, does this child fit into one of these categories? And so they'll look at the definition of each one, and they're spelled out in great detail in the federal regulations. State, you can look it up and see how autism is defined, how of any number of the categories. Another example that is particularly hard to define is the category of emotional disability. So this category is for kids who have mood disorders, depression, anxiety, other types of emotional needs that prevent them from performing in school without special education. And so that can be a very tricky category because what's the line between depression and anxiety and the sort of non-disabled part of the kid. And you'll see this sort of conflict where the school is struggling to decide, the whole team is struggling to decide, is this just a choice? Is the kid just being bad, for example? Or is it really because of a disability? And so that tension you'll see arise in lots of different types of special education questions. But that's just to give you an example of some different other categories: intellectual disability, physical disability. We hear ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's actually not a category for ADHD. That appears in a different category for other health impairment, sort of this catch-all category that can include a number of different things, but is mainly where you'll find ADHD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Looks like we have to wrap up right now, but we want to talk about discipline.
Sure.
As we're wrapping this up, and also where parents can go to for help in trying to help their child.
Yeah, I want to spend the most time trying to talk about the second question about local resources, because I think there's a lot, and certainly there's a lot online, especially every day you see more and more. But the issue of discipline is particularly interesting and distressing. Students who are in special education can be suspended.
We have 2 minutes. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's some additional protections for them, but what you'll see are rates of suspension that disproportionately impact students with disabilities and students of color, and so that's a real problem. What do we do about that, especially in Virginia? But local resources, there's a lot. We're very lucky in the Charlottesville area to have lots of organizations who deal with these issues. One is mine, the Just Children program at the Legal Aid Justice Center. It's Just Children, one word. Really easy to find. Our website is justiceforall.org. You can find all of our information there. We have a handy guide called Helping You Help Your Child, which is about that thick and has tons of information in a very accessible way. We have it available in Spanish too. So that's where I'd point parents to go first. Basic information. Second thing is there's other places for parents to get info. There's an organization called PREP. It's the Piedmont Regional Education Program. That's actually administered by the schools. Wealth of information there and really helpful folks who can answer individual questions. For kids with autism, parents dealing with autism, the school I used to work, Virginia Institute of Autism, is a great resource that has a huge library. Also just your healthcare provider. Talk to your doctor. Family and friends. There's lots of information out there.
Okay. Thank you for coming and sharing with us, Attorney Mario Salas.
My pleasure.
Our guest, and we have talked about what parents need to know about special education. I'm your host, Melvin Burris. You can also watch us on the web at YouTube. Just go to neighborhoodlawcenter.com and you see a series of programs. If you missed this one, you can go to the web and see it there, and give a counselor a call. We give your information so they can give you a call.
Call me anytime. Our phone number is 977-0553. Again, our website is justiceforall.org.
Okay. Thank you again, and I'm your host again, Melvin Burris, our guest Mario Salas, and we'll see you next week. Peace and God bless.